My name is Dr. David Chao, and I am the director of the Center for Asian American Christianity. Joining me today is my colleague, Dr. Aaron Stauffer. Hi, Aaron. How are you?
Good, David. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Dr. Aaron Stauffer is the director of online learning and associate director of the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. He earned his PhD in social ethics at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York and has organized with the Industrial Areas Foundation in San Antonio, Texas, and Religions for Peace. Aaron, guess what I got in the mail recently?
Finally, it made it to you. I'm glad.
I'm holding up a copy of Listening to the Spirit, the Radical Social Gospel, Sacred Value, and Broad-Based Community Organizing, published by Oxford University Press. I think the copyright year, is it 2024?
It is. February. Just came out.
It's like hot off the press.
Yeah.
And I am fortunate enough to have a physical copy.
Yeah.
I believe the syndicate will be hosting a forum later this summer on it. So this book will stir a lot of conversation in the next year within Christian theology and Christian ethics circles. And we're privileged to have Aaron as a guest on our podcast to talk about social pragmatism, the spirit at work in community organizing, and politics. So, Aaron, I look forward to this podcast conversation with you.
David, this is so great. We have had, actually, our mutual friend and colleague, Jonathan Tran, introduced us maybe about 2 years ago, and we have had almost quarterly meetings since then. So it's a joy to always be in conversation with you. I so appreciate the work you're doing. You're a real leader in your field. So it's just an honor to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. I feel like this podcast conversation is really just hitting record on our very numerous and frequent engagement on all things social pragmatism, communities, and the spirit. So this is kind of old hat for Aaron and me, since we've been chatting about a lot of these themes that are now publicly available in his published books. So
that's right.
This is a lot of fun. Maybe we can just begin with your title, Listening to the Spirit.
Yeah.
I really like that book title. Can you say more about why and how you chose your book title?
Yeah, this is great. Well, I'm really bad at titles. It comes from the core argument of the book, which is that some organizing practices are religious practices. And I make a particular argument around how the relational meeting, which we can get into a little bit later, and the listening campaign are actual religious practices of congregations and Christians as they attend to themselves and others, and the way that God is moving through the Spirit, moving Christians closer together, and then spiraling outward, right, into the public, and where God is calling them into the work of building economic and political power. That argument depends on a particular method of social ethics, a particular philosophical theology grounded in a framework of social pragmatism, where I see spirit here not only talking about the Holy Spirit, what Christians are more familiar with, but also spirit as a way of talking about the sorts of ethical communities that we foster, that we build, that we develop. So listening to the Spirit, I think, is a catchy term because maybe sort of religious people and Christian folk will be, oh yeah, like this. Well, yeah, he means the Holy Spirit. But then once you kind of get deeper in it, yes, there's other aspects here to it. It's listening to the Spirit has many valences in the sense, and so it's significant for me in that way. And then it's a typical academic book. You have a title, and then you have three things after it, after a colon, right? Radical social gospel, sacred value, and broad-based community organizing. And those are, then you really get into the meat of everything I'm talking about here. It's sort of surprising, like when Oxford put this up first on the website, the related titles that come up next to it are all in Pentecostal studies. So,
interesting.
Yeah, the pneumatology here, the sense is true, but it's which is actually, I think, a unique strength of the book, that it brings different conversation partners together, and unintentionally, perhaps, for those, or maybe in an unexpected way for readers, in a way that doesn't feel disingenuous, but I think it's actually, oh yeah, this is true. This is when I listen to what God is calling me to do, and where God is calling me to go and to be, and how to live out my Christian faith, my Christian religious identity. It is actually has a lot to do with building economic and political power. So yeah, I started with other titles like Fire in the Bones, but then Mark Warren, who's written a couple of books on community organizing, I already have that title. So I can't choose that again. So I was like, wait, what about? And I was actually texting with my PhD advisor, Gary Dorian, about this. And when I shot him listening to the Spirit, he said, oh, I love it.
Yep.
Okay.
The Spirit in him resonated with the Spirit in you to
That's
confirm
right.
listening to the Spirit. So, Aaron, you mentioned community organizing several times already, and it's in your subtitle.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you had this background in community organizing. Can you just share a little bit of your community organizing background, even before your graduate studies, and how your community organizing background fed into some of the main themes of the book?
Yeah, it's really part of my story into theological education. I went to seminary because I was organizing. After college, I grew up in a small town in Kansas where the church was the center of community. So I was always already involved in conversations around the church's responsibility to its broader neighborhood and its community. Growing up in this sort of place, the setting, the small town of about 5,000 people, the church is just where things happened. And it's where I really learned about, honestly, like power relationships. For example, it's like if I wanted to get things done at my local church in Kansas, I went to Sally, the matriarch of the congregation. I didn't go to the pastor because the pastor works for Sally. The pastor works for the session of the small town Presbyterian church. And Sally is the one who's been there for 40 years. Sally is the one who knows the relationships, who's earned the authority of that congregation. And who really within her own being, her own self, her own identity, her own story, carries the story of that church. And so I didn't come to that full realization of how much I had learned by becoming actively involved in a congregation when I was young and a teenager and until later. But it really has been one long path this way. So I was involved in community organizing and community work broadly throughout college, but then cut my teeth in it after college when I organized for the Industrial Areas Foundation in San Antonio, Texas, with Community to Organize for Public Service. And what's significant about this, COPS and Metro down there, is that was COPS Metro was the first industrial areas affiliate where congregations were dues-paying members of the Broad-Based Organizing Coalition. And broad-based organizing is a framework of community transformation that creates organizations of organizations. And so members of an affiliate of a larger national network, like the Industrial Areas Foundation is a national network, and it has local affiliates all across the country. Members of those local affiliates are churches, unions, schools, synagogues, mosques, other organizations. And so my work with them was really to build strong institutions, develop teams there, and build individual leaders who understood the work of community organizing and its foundations. But I fell in love with it because I fell in love with organizing because it helped and asked individual Christians and people of faith to think about their relationship with their beliefs and their religious tradition in regard to power. It helped them think about how it is that their own beliefs and their religious tradition help them transform the world from the way that it is to the way that it ought to be, right? And this is a very, that's a ripe tension between the reality in which we confront the world and the way it ought to be. But I also had some interesting conversations with organizers where I felt that they undervalued the role that theology and religion or spirituality plays within organizing. They sometimes saw it in an instrumental fashion, but most often too, there was a sort of underlying sense in which religion and religious beliefs were a little bit too, quote unquote, sort of enthusiastic, a little untamely. This is a little bit too provocative. These were the things that, you wanted to use religion in order to cultivate a strategy to build wins on the right issues within the organizing framework. But anything else that people felt dearly about or cared a lot about, we didn't really want to engage that because that might divide the constituency. So I had this experience where I was in a coffee shop after I was talking with some leaders, and then I went up to this organizer and said that I was going to lead a congregation through a biblical study, and was really excited about digging deep into the theological basis and helping people explore the theological basis of organizing and helping people explore their own individual callings to it. And he said something really interesting, and I relate this story in the book, right? Which is that if you want to do theology, go get a theologian. Organizing is about building power. And I felt that that was such an odd thing for an organizer to say, though true, organizing is about building power, but so is theology. Theology is deeply concerned with power because Christian faith is deeply concerned with politics, right? The goods that we share in common and the contestation over them. And furthermore, and this is the core of the argument of the book, really, is that people organize to protect and fight for what they hold most dear. That's what sends them into the fight in the first place. People start organizing. They get angry because things that they care deeply about are threatened or violated in ways that that provoke a response from them. And they talk to others about it, and they build relationships. And from those relationships, power emerges, right? Relational power. So then I went to seminary because I was like, I do want to do theology, or at least social ethics. And so I went to Union for my MDiv and my PhD, and then I gained a lot more experience in terms of interfaith community organizing with Religions for Peace in the South. Here, I started an anti-Islamophobia program, a public education program in Tennessee, in North Carolina, and up in Minnesota, and just learned, continued to complicate the framework of relational organizing around these questions of sacred values, what we hold most dear, how they play in the organizing strategy, and how that can help us improvise and expand our political theological imaginaries, what we think is politically possible due to our theological beliefs and the roles that theology plays in organizing. So it's foundational. It's foundational to my journey of theological education. I often say this is where I'll end up. I think some of the best theological education I've ever received was in the organizing circle and continues to be that way. And I think theological education has a lot to learn from alternative pedagogies and models of learning and formation that are crafted and fostered in places like community organizing networks.
I love it, Aaron. There's so much there to talk about. I want to maybe highlight some binaries that I heard come up. And I know early in the book, you talk about the sacred secular binary, that coffee shop conversation about community organizers build power and theologians do theology. Mm-hmm. And you're kind of questioning, well, is that too simple an understanding of how we assign roles to community organizers and theologians? And then you're talking about the church, but you're also talking about shared common values and goods with people not in the church. So there's a church and world kind of boundary going on there. I'm gonna kind of bring in a phrase. Mm-hmm. It might be the first time our audience has heard of this phrase, but you and I spend a lot of time talking about social pragmatism as a philosophical method for Christian ethics and Christian theology that may begin to help see beyond these binaries that we just established. Yeah. So maybe, and I know this is a big part, a kind of a conceptual engine throughout the entire work, is your engagement with social pragmatism as a method and as a philosophical framework. But let's make it concrete. How does social pragmatism help you address these binaries?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, and it's partly why I set out in the first chapter, the second chapter here, after the preface, the sort of method, what I mean by the radical social gospel, because the social pragmatism, the way I go about pursuing these questions, is grounded in an inductive methodology that is at the heart of the founding of the field of social ethics, and also one stream of social gospelers who were predominantly Christian socialists. And so there's a radical going to the root of this call of social gospel and social ethics to transform the structures of society in the directions of social justice, right? So we begin to develop a language, or these figures who helped found the field developed a language around social sin, social injustices, social justice, the fact that there is something called society and various individuals have rights and roles and claims within this, and think about the power at a structural and societal level, not merely at a moral and individual level. And the founders of the field of social ethics began really by throwing their students into the middle of social movements, and by asking them, at least for me, this is one way to talk about it, is that they asked them to listen first. Harry Ward, one of the core figures of this movement, had 3 steps that he always asked his students. The method was pretty simple. What are the facts? What do they mean? And what should be done? So the disposition is one of listening, of attending to the realities that are already happening in the context that you're situated in first, rather than bringing things in and presuming, right? And so the social pragmatism after this is also dawns a sort of attending to the realities that already exist now, rather than bringing in larger, grander questions about reality and trying to fit that to what it is we see in the people that we're working with. And so one way is to think about this is the contrast. And this is one of the thinkers writes about this, is it says sometimes we get caught in applying a model of reality rather than attending to the reality of our model, what is in front of us right here. And so we often get caught in the presuppositions that we're supposed to bring to the field, as opposed to listening, attending to people. So part of the social pragmatism is a social ethical disposition about how it is we go about our work and pursuing our questions. That philosophically, that means a couple of things, especially for those who are in the tradition of social pragmatism, which is broadly, one crude way to think about it is that ideas are tools that help us solve specific problems in the world. So this is a very, John Deweyan way of thinking about it, and Jeff Stoudian way of thinking about it. For those who are familiar with Princeton, Jeff Stoud's a long religion professor there who's recently retired, who is a wonderful thinker in this field and a teacher of mine. Even though I didn't go to Princeton, he was generous enough to let me to attend a couple of his seminars over the years that I did my graduate work there. And I know you've been in conversation with him a lot too. So this is partly what I say.
Deeply formative for my own outlooks here. So we have a converging shared interest and dialogue over the social pragmatism of Princeton and beyond. Exactly. Please continue.
And it's the generosity of the relationships, right? That's partly what I mean here. It's less of name dropping and more of like it's an intellectual community that you find yourself with. And so you think about ideas as tools. You're less interested in the one way of thinking about this is in other frameworks, there's the truth of the meta narrative, the capital T truth. And I'm less less interested in pursuing questions of capital T truth throughout this, and more of using and providing a conceptual framework that fits the reality that people live in, how things feel right for them. I'm interested in getting things right in this way, rather than thinking about whether I have established the capital T truth in that. And so this makes the book, the questions that it pursue, less sort of quote unquote theological and, what's the true doctrine of God here, and instead, how are people living out their Christian lives, and what can we say about that? What's the significance of that? And significance then these are always sort of ethical questions that turn back to each other, right? It's significance to whom? Who attributes the significance, right? And all sorts of these things. So social pragmatism provides a methodology for me to think about how it is that I am disposed and oriented to these conversations. So the book itself draws from a lot of my organizing experience, and so I try and lift it up and analyze it, and even kind of fold back on myself a little bit to say there are points when I got this wrong, and this is what I've learned from organizers, and they corrected me in this way. So I try to hold myself accountable to the community that I'm writing with and to, and it provides me a sense where ideas are tools that help me solve problems in the world, which then provides a deep commitment to democracy, and to thinking about democracy not merely as a polity, but as an ethical way of life, because I'm interested in solving social problems. And I'm interested then in voice and agency of all, and that kind of pervades the whole thing. So there's larger. I mean, we can get really quick into this about what's the epistemology of this and how it is.
Oh yeah,
but
we'll get there. We'll get there. Let me recap this really textured account of social pragmatism. What I'm hearing from you, Aaron, is social pragmatism helps you to solve actual problems in the world.
Yes.
You mentioned this disposition of attending to reality, and cited that triptych of facts and meaning and doing.
Yeah.
And it strikes me, just a side note here, listening carefully and attending to reality, this is a lot of what pastors do.
Oh, amen. Right? Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Pastors are kinds of ethnographers, because you're also describing the participant observer in the ethnographic or anthropological realm. They're carefully attending to these particular pockets of reality, this inductive approach you were talking about. And then the philosophical payoff is this sort of inductive, empirical, descriptive discipline then begins to dissolve some of the preconceptions or binaries that we began with. Did you want to comment on any of that?
No, I think that's right. And this is why I love being in conversation with you, David, because you are such a wonderful and clear thinker about this stuff. Absolutely. And applying it to people face lives so quickly. Like, yes, amen. Pastors are already well on their way to thinking in line with community organizing strategies. I think that's very clear. And I think they already understand that ideas are tools, and they can see how it is that people use theology in their lives. This is why it's, in popular discourse, people think about bad theology and the power of it, right? Theology is ideas. The ideas are tools. They're, they're not always used for good, right? And so we need to marshal them in ways that for our ends. But then this also tools, when you end up like attending to reality, facts also then become a lot more complicated, because it's not, you realize all of a sudden in any congregation will understand that something happens in a congregation and 20 people see it, and you've got 20 different perspectives of what has happened. And so all of a sudden the multiplicity of our world, the thickness and layeredness of meanings become textured really, really very quickly. And meaning then ends up cashing out in in use. And so, the concepts and the way we talk about what it is we do is a socially structured process. And so talking about how it is we talk about what it is we do is really important, right? It's how are the shared meanings of what does it mean to be a church? What does it mean to build power? What does it mean to be called to do this? To attend to the Spirit? What does it mean to say something is an injustice? All of these are really viable questions because then it calls the congregation to attend to each other and then discern together and then move together and then act together.
And I want to hook into what you're saying about what is the meaning of church? What is the meaning of this thing or that thing?
Yeah.
And then we attend to the world.
Yeah.
And we're attending in particular to social practices.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to describe what a social practice is, why it's helpful to describe social practices to get at things like sacred values, norms and authorities, and maybe even begin sussing out how this came into play with your community organizing? And any case studies you want to share?
Yeah, that's really helpful. So we'll begin on the sort of heady part and maybe get to the practical part. I mean, this fits really well with the social pragmatism, right? Because this, one way to think about this is, how does the world work? And the world works by, one way in which we can talk about individuals making sense of the world around them is through social practices and social practical reasoning. So individuals are reasoners. We make judgments about the world and the others in it, and they make judgments about ourselves too. And so we hold ourselves accountable to those judgments, and we take each other seriously as adequate sources of authority within the world. If you say you're going to do something, I'm going to hold you accountable to it. Like, all right, do it. And this is. But that's a sort of explicit part of it. I think a lot of times what happens in the social pragmatism is this just happens without people actually talking about it, without actually, it's just, oh, okay, well, this is how we communicate. This is how we get by in the world. This is just how self-consciousness works itself out within the world, is that we're able to make judgments about ourselves and each other and the things in the world, and that is a social process. So norms and shared values they're socially established, which means they're grounded in shared assumptions, shared values, shared attitudes and expectations about the world. And so we are social creatures, right? Everything is deeply relational in this way. And this then means, too, that this scales up, too. So when we think about institutions, then even in terms of, one way to think about this is in terms of gender or social identities, they are practices. There's ways of acting like a man that are shared, that are established and that are authoritative, normative, right? And sometimes not always good. This is the power then of language like toxic masculinity, or things like racial practices, so that we can have other understandings of this is what it means to practice whiteness, and how then whiteness gets established and is normative in our world, is like water in that way. Well, this doesn't mean that this account then of how it is that individuals work in the world and reason in the world, through shared practices, social practices of reasoning. It's consistent. It is an activity, right? It doesn't mean that things need be the way that they are. There are counter practices, counter cultures. We can judge certain practices, even within our own Christian tradition, as racist or misogynistic by alternative norms. This is not a way just to make sense of the world as an argument for the status quo. Instead, you can do radical, if things are shared in the practice, then it kind of frees you to actually make radical critiques about how things are, and then from that be constructive of where things ought to go. And so this is part of the freedom then, this is the process then of community organizing. Because, I've got two kids, I care a lot about daycare and about the cost of childcare.
Yeah.
Because it's really expensive.
It's super expensive.
And it need not be that way. Because I see and know other ways that our society has been structured.
Yep.
And we can change that. How do we change that? Well, you can start by thinking about how it is that you are talking with others about it and finding other ways to do. One way to do it, that's just the real quick example, what the difference is between for-profit childcare versus cooperative childcare. And how it is that like a co-op childcare, the way in which the profit and the wages of that business are democratically governed and shared. And so then the way in which that practice within the economy has then shifted to a much more radically democratic way of sharing the profits and running a business. And so just the freedom of seeing things need not be the way that they are. There are alternatives that have been grounded within our faith. Churches have been wonderful sources of co-ops and particularly of co-op childcares. We can talk about practical, really simple issues. This doesn't need to talk about. We don't need to be in the epistemology all day. Let's just talk about how does we live our lives together. And this helps us think about things that are sometimes overwhelming and too big in really practical and down-to-earth ways. Because institutions are collections of social practices, and individuals live in and perpetuate those systems and structures, which means that you can also live counter to it and build power with others to build other institutions, right? This isn't the final thing I'll say here. This is not a short circuit argument. Well, in order to solve climate change, you just need to recycle. No, this is about understanding that systems and structures are extremely powerful within our lives, but it's also not giving a way to a nihilism or an inadequacy about our lives. It's that you can build power, and it starts with understanding at that basic philosophical and theological point.
I really like your near at hand example of childcare. Mm-hmm. For anyone with young children, this is a quotidian fact of life, of daily, regular commutes, waiting at the gate, signing in, signing out, chatting with other parents while they're waiting for their kid, asking how, this activity went and that. And so there's a sense in which the childcare is a gathering of practices, like discrete practices, but it is itself a kind of social practice.
Amen.
And because of your participation, given your small children, you have been observing things. You have been attending to the world of childcare. Yeah. And through this attendance over time, certain patterns emerge. And as you think about, well, this is costing X amount per month. Could it cost less than that? Because I'd like to save more money because money is hard to come by. Yeah. And then perhaps you talk to other parents who have the exact same question and concern with you. Yeah. This type of inductive description and attendance to the world then makes explicit, there's something called a for-profit business model that is normative for my participation in this social practice. And once you've named it and made it explicit, it has perhaps less determining force because by the virtue of describing it, you can then imagine something other.
That's exactly right. You just, again, David, like wonderful. Yeah. Extrapolation of all these fine points. And it hits with other practices. Marriage. How is it that you were with your partner? How is it that I am social? How is it? Or even, let's bring in not even just childcare, but then child rearing. How is it that I am teaching my young white son how to, about what it means to be a white man, or a white, who's someone is sexed in this way. And it's tricky, but these are daily practices that are not completely over our control, right? Because we're cultural and social beings. And so but there is understanding that the way that the things are deeply relational helps us get a sense of the possibility and the immenseness of the work, right? So it increases our agency, I think, is clear to us then, but it also says, I can't do this alone. And it really shows us the seriousness with which we need to then go about this daily work, while also understanding that it is daily work. It's organizing is slow and patient work. It is about building power, and power is important. Power is the capacity to change, to act with efficacy, and that's difficult to come by because it's about relationships, and those are inevitably grounded in values that we hold most dear. Yeah.
I remember from our previous conversations, and I do believe it found its way into the book. Mm-hmm. There was this case from your community organizing experience where there was conflict in the community between religious groups.
Yeah.
There was perhaps an imam,
yes,
from the mosque, and perhaps a rabbi, and there was or church, mainline church pastor, and they disagreed on a topic X.
Yeah.
But the community organizer needs them to work together, right? Yeah. So how does a community organizing perspective or even social pragmatism help move beyond the impasse? So
that's great.
And this could be interreligious, but it could also be within the same religion. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of the Asian and Asian American church, where there's contestation between generations.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's conflicting cultural norms, normative sources of authority, how they see the world, etc. And that needs to be navigated, or there becomes fracturing of community.
That's right.
So on this larger issue of disagreement and contestation, how does the spirit of community organizing as well as social pragmatism help?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is really important because it's social pragmatism provides for us a sense that there is already a world of plural values. So we've got people feel differently about different things. We value the goods of the world in different ways and at different amounts. And so this is a good thing, and it's not a bad thing. And so again, the social pragmatism just helps us understand the value pluralism, right, which is really important. But it also then helps us understand, the social pragmatism understands that the relationships of difference are relationships, and they're very deep relationships. So we think about, this is the undergirding philosophy of this, how it is that these relationships get established in terms of identities in the first place, and then bring us into actual relationships, deeper relationships, right? This is just how the spirit of our ethical relationships get off the ground and build into something else in the first place. And this is grounded in the philosophical theology of G.W. Hegel, right? And so we think about the dialectic here, which is, we don't need to go into this, but it's just important to understand that material differences are deep relationships. And it's the determined difference, like the clear actual difference, they're deep relationships, and that's really.
In other words, difference is a form of relationship.
Yeah, amen, 100%, and it's a very deep one. It's not a superficial one, and so that there's deep potential there, and especially then when you think about this in terms of sacred values, what it is we hold most dear, the goods and the people in the world that we hold sacred, that we find that their value is objective. That it is inviolable, and that it's something that is incomparable. It's not something that's on a scale. It's something that's just axiomatic, just there. Like, yes, if I'm using my children here, like the value of my sons, it's clearly that they have sacred value. That it doesn't fall on a scale in terms of money. Right? That I can't value my son's life in terms of money. But it also is something that if somebody were to hurt my son, no, there's the reactions that I have, the metaphysical reactions, like, oh no, clearly you are infringing and violating a value that is in my, that is in the ontology of being of my son, right? So these are certain sort of values, evaluative attitudes that we take up to people. because of the way in which we love them. But people feel differently about different things. The abolitionist believes that the mass incarceration system infringes and violates the sacred value of the human dignity of an individual. The abortion rights activist thinks that, the fetus is a person and abortion violates the sacred value of personhood. The Native American, lands right activist believes that certain land is held sacred and the current use of it violates the way in which they hold it sacred. So we feel differently about these different things, but they're relationships, and they all, and they throw us into the fight. And so what the important practices then of community organizing, right, of the relational meeting, which is a public, intentional, time-limited, value-directed conversation between two people about what it is they hold most dear and what they're willing to do to protect and fight for it. That's a practice that helps us attend to, listen to the other, give testimony to our own experiences, and then to discern the way that God is moving for the Christian, the way that God's Spirit is moving us into deeper relationship with this person and out into public. It's much easier to say that we have these enclaves that we're just different. It's much more difficult, but much more worthwhile to discover these stories of self and other that bring us into different relationships with each other, and how it is that we can appreciate and take the other seriously as a reasoner who cares deeply about the world in the similar way that I do, but perhaps ends up on different places, and how it is that we are actually bound together, what the relationships then of solidarity look like. So that's how organizing, what the payoff then is for the practices of organizing around the differences in sacred value.
Wow, there's so much there. I'm going to try to be a disciplined facilitator of a conversation because I have these other questions I need to get to, I want to get to. It strikes me that I have a feeling, Aaron, you and I are going to be having another podcast at another point where we can go somewhat deeper into these fascinating topics. But you and I have been talking about some of the foundations and conceptual framing feeding into the book. I want to talk about the book a little bit more explicitly now. What is the main argument of the book?
The main argument of the book is that there are some practices within community organizing that are religious practices because of the role of sacred value in our social practical reasoning and lived theological lives, and so lived religious lives. And once you attend to the role then that sacred values play within community organizing, it's not merely just, some of these organizing practices are religious practices. That's interesting. But it's also the fact that once you realize that, then you can go deeper and expand the political imaginaries for both the church and also organizing itself. So you can address the heretofore limits within the practice of organizing, which has been simply that they only pick issues that are winnable, right? Or the overemphasis on winnable issues rather than digging into these deep relationships of difference. So that's the overall. That's the quick and dirty.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So part of what I'm hearing you offer is an intervention, perhaps, in how community organizing has been done when it comes to religious communities. And you kind of alluded to this earlier in the conversation, insofar as it perhaps marginalizes or minimizes the power and influence of the religious belief of the religious community, which is a strange thing to do if those religious beliefs and values are perhaps the strongest motivators of those religious communities. And so it seems that there could be certain practices of community organizing leading a lot of power on the table, so to speak, not activated because of whatever binaries are being at work.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, this is partly at the end where I end too, where I think that the church is best identified by its task, by its activity, identified by building practices of reciprocal relationships of liberation and love. And so I think that's that there's an extreme potential here for us to think about some of these other things that you've talked about here, which I think people are struggling in the church, which is, what does it mean to be the church? How do we continue to build the church in a time of institutional decline?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's partly really important here, is for us to think about the potential for congregations and the work of discipleship, of evangelism, of testimony. All of that is super important.
Aaron, we have to come to an end. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for chatting with me about listening to the Spirit and community organizing. I have a feeling the audience has learned a tremendous amount in listening to our conversation, and I want to continue it with you. So thank you for talking with me today.
And now we begin the second part of this 2-part podcast.
Good morning, Aaron.
Good morning.
How are you?
Doing all right. It's good to be here with you, David. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We weren't able to finish everything in the first part of our podcast conversation on your book, Listening to the Spirit, the Radical Social Gospel, Sacred Value, and Broad-Based Community Organizing, just out by Oxford University Press. So we're having this second follow-up conversation. So I'm really glad that you have time to chat with me about your book and just themes related to the book. Before we started the second part, you and I were just talking about democratic politics and how that is a major kind of purpose of your work, is to help community organizers and church people expand their imagination regarding democratic politics. And so I want to continue discussing that big picture. I'm also teaching courses that appropriate a social practical theory for doing Christian theology. And we were last time talking about social practices. When we talk about democracy, we're talking perhaps about how power is organized, perhaps even within institutions that are historically extended and socially embodied. Mm-hmm. And so right there, I'm beginning to invoke some classic language within Christian ethics in the 20th century, specifically from Alistair McIntyre. So I have in front of me After Virtue, and I just want to read 2 quotes. The first is on page 222, where McIntyre says, "A living tradition, then, is an historically extended, socially embodied argument, and an argument precisely in part about the goods which constitute that tradition. Mm-hmm. Within a tradition, the pursuit of goods extends through generations, sometimes through many generations." So that's his definition of tradition. And then I want to pivot to page 187, and you yourself cite this this passage, kind of a famous passage, especially amongst ethicists and moral theorists. Here's where McIntyre, in reflecting upon Aristotle and some of the Greek tradition, he says, "By a practice, I'm going to mean any coherent and complex form of socially established, cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity, with the result that human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended." That is a mouthful. It's a bit technical, but I thought we could begin with some specific passages to prime the pump with respect to our conversation on democracy. So just as the Spirit leads, Aaron, feel free to comment on McIntyre and how it maybe informs your vision of democratic politics and practice.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, I fell in love with organizing because it really helps people of faith understand how it is that their spirituality, their religious traditions can be a part of rebuilding and repairing our democratic life together. This was real. Organizing provides people with tools and ideas and handles on how to transform the world in really simple ways, right? Transformation here is perhaps a grand conception here, but I think oftentimes it starts small.
And what's really important about this to me is, as you were talking about it, democratic life, is that democracy for me and for, many thinkers within the 20th century who find themselves closer to the social pragmatist view, see democracy as a way of life rather than a polity, or not merely a polity. It's about the ethics, about how we are together, about the relationships that we establish with our neighbors and the goods that we hold most dear, and how it is that we go about protecting for them, caring for them, distributing them, producing them, all sorts of things. So that in itself is an important transition, right? To think about the connection between community organizing and democratic life. And in some ways, this is really, basic. It's about basic congregational life together. It's about how it is that we make decisions, as if you're in the Presbyterian Church, as a session, about who gets elected to positions of authority, and then the relationships of accountability that are established through those elections. So democratic life in this sense there is something pretty basic and important about local politics in this way. And that in itself is really different because you get, in our time, so much of our political imagination is focused on national elections, and they're dominated by big money, rather than thinking about local politics, local fair wage endeavors, local green initiatives, local transportation issues. This is really important. And perhaps it's just because I grew up in a small town in Kansas where, local life is everything. It's really important. It's the church's role and individual congregations' role in the local community is all the more important because it as an institution, as a collective of people who have decided to go about their lives together in a certain way, have power, have influence, right? Or and they've organized themselves and they've organized their money, and so they can act efficiently and effectively. And that is really important, I think, for broad-based organizing, because once you begin to think about democratic life together, you can begin to think about how that democratic life is structured, right? So what are the big players in this story? And they're often not small local congregations. And for democratic politics and for broad-based organizing, one big point that I make in the book is that as I talked about earlier, broad-based organizing coalitions are organizations of organizations. But this organization has a particular power relationship to the overarching power structure. So they're counter-publics in this way, which means that inevitably what they're doing is countercultural. That most often the people who find themselves in these coalitions are those who find themselves exploited, oppressed, marginalized by the larger power structures, which is, to talk really specifically.
So I want to interrupt briefly because I want to lead into the counter-publics piece, but first tease out some more definitions for our audience. So you've been talking a lot about power, and I even remember that coffee shop conversation from part one of our conversation where you said you're talking with someone and they said, when it comes, leave organizing for power to the community organizer and do theology with the theologians. And they're kind of splitting how power works. You have a more basic or even comprehensive understanding of power. So just lay out a definition of what power is.
Yeah. So power is, for me, power is the ability to act with efficacy, with significance. I mean, the classic definition here of power is just the ability to act, but it's always contextual. It's always relational. Power in this way is not top down, not dominating figures through figures of the boss or the tyrant, but instead is relational. It's always horizontal this way.
I want to tie in the Macintyrian piece about how traditions, practices, institutions offer constraints upon the arbitrary exercise of power, such that power is organized. And then I think you and I are very keen on democratizing and sharing and distributing that power. So say more about how, we were talking about anarchy, we were talking about radicalness, we were talking about in this kind of the implicit other pole of conservatism. Say more about how your view of democratic power fits within the range of options politically when it comes to organizing power or not.
Yeah. Power is the ability to act with efficacy. Power is not only just about giving a punch, to use that metaphor, it's also about receiving one. It's also about a receptiveness, right? Power is not only just an outward expression. It's also about the ability to receive and adapt in this way. If power is relational, there's a number of different ways to organize it. Some of the ways of organizing it, that we've seen within political structures or even within economic structures, set up relationships in a ways that are not accountable or not where each person's voice is not equally taken into account. So you get alternative models of political structures. You get fascism, you get democracy, you get representative democracy, you get socialism, you get communism, you get anarchism, you get all sorts of different ways in which people want to collectivize and organize these relationships of voice and agency and political representation. For me, I think the really important part about this is thinking about how it is that broad-based organizing connects the church to a living political and economic tradition about how it is that we should organize power grounded in the ethics of the social gospel, of reading the gospel in a way that cares about justice and equality and about righteousness. And so this connects within MacIntyre's understanding of a tradition, right? There is a living tradition within a living argument within the Christian tradition about how it is that power in our social lives ought to be structured. And democracy in this way is about grounding it in notions of accountability, authority as always grounded in relationships of voice and agency and accountability again, but also then responsibility. So this is a very, again, horizontal power relationship where you do have roles of leadership, which need not be dominating because that leadership is always earned and accountable to those that they are supposedly, quote unquote, representing, right? And so the tradition here through Christian thought is one of prizing particular norms and values of justice, of righteousness, of expressing people's faith in transforming the structures of society in the direction of justice. So you get an account, one, of power as institutionalized, as collectivized, but it's not dominating because it's always accountable. And if that accountability is disregarded, then leaders are replaced, right? This is the important definition here between democracy and tyranny, right? Tyranny means that the leader, that the king is now acting against the good of the ruled in this way. And so this is, using that particular term of a tyrant means that you're going against the role of that office and the goods that are prized by it. And so in the long tradition of democratic thought here too, calling somebody a tyrant is not just an offhanded remark. Instead, it's a pretty strong invective against the role and how it is that one is operating in that way. So for today, what broad-based organizing offers for individual Christians is a way of enacting their political and economic life that is founded in the values of the social gospel, of righteousness, of justice, of love, of liberation. And this, it goes back then to that coffee shop conversation where I had just walked my congregation through a study on Exodus and power in the biblical traditions. And the organizer responds to me, if you want to do theology, go get a theologian. But organizing is about building power. And my point here is that theology is about power, and power is theological. Because it has to do, especially with our Christian life and the way that we love and care for the things that we hold most dear, right? Humans are lovers. And so sometimes we misorganize our loves in ways that, or disorganize them in ways that go against how it is that we ought to be, but it provides for us a broader vision of the proper ordering of who we are. And all of that is established, through God's gracious initiative in the first place. So the relationship then between a Christian tradition of the social gospel, the practices that are collectively established through time, shared and collectively established around certain goods that a practice prizes, and then reaches for to realize, right? Those connections then are rich within the Christian tradition. If you think even just about some simple practices that are collected, most often collectively shared. And you think about this often, David, right? Like think about the practice of baptism in certain places, the practice of the Eucharist in certain places, the differences and shared commonalities between them. I think, and the whole point of the book here, at least in one sense, is to help us think about how it is that certain practices, certain activities within broad-based organizing are religious practices that fit within a particular tradition of Christian thought and action. So those two practices then are the relational meeting and the listening campaign that help us think about what it means to be Christian. And then I'll end here with a story on this to kind of ground it, because this has been pretty high flying. So one of the stories that I share is that I was organizing a church and moving them through a listening campaign, which is a 6-month or maybe, shorter process that a congregation or an institution can adopt, where it undergoes a series of relational meetings internally. And relational meetings are time-bound, intentional public conversations about what people care most about and what they're willing to do to protect and fight for them. So I'm going to sit down and have coffee with you, and I'm going to talk to you about what it is that where your work is, what you care most about, what's going on. I'm going to search for stories. It's a value-directed conversation. So I'm going to try and ask, who taught you to care about the things that you care about? We talked about earlier in the previous conversation around childcare. And so then family comes up with an important value with me, say, because of, then you'll get even richer stories about my own life growing up with my grandparents and, just understanding the richness of and the models that I had. And so you learn about people, you're really listening to them, but you're also listening to the movement of the Spirit about where God is calling us together and how it is that God is calling us out into public. Again, it's that spiral movement. When an institution undergoes this, it can be a really transformative process because it reweaves the fabric of a congregation together. And people learn more about people that they thought they knew everything about already. And then finally, what happened through this process of a congregation is that they ended up having a commissioning ceremony for all of the listeners who were going to undergo these conversations. And they set it within their liturgy right after the baptism. They connected it to the baptism, but they did it right after the sermon. And so within the liturgy of a Reformed congregation in this way, right, you read the scripture, and then a sermon is a response to the word of God. And then positioning then that liturgy, that expression of a commissioning service of the listeners shows, and connecting it then, all the listeners came up right next to the baptismal font, connecting it then to our baptismal commitment of who we are as Christians, of our Christian life together, shows how deeply connected this individual church saw its work of listening to each other and working together and to enact and build the kingdom of God in a way that truly is responding to God's word in this way. And it was really, it's not, the liturgy itself is not like amazing. It's not transformative. I'm not a liturgist in this way, but it is the importance of is showing the commonality of it and about how simple and plain, and in a way, how beautiful that is, because that helps us see how clear this work is connected. It clearly connected this work is to our Christian life, which is basic and elemental in that way. So that was a long story, but I wanted to ground it.
It's a beautiful story. And I just want to identify how these listening sessions, which is a skill and practice within broad-based community organizing, lends itself in the congregational context to simply pastoral care. So I imagine pastors do this under a different category or name, as well as in a lot of the spiritual direction, spiritual formation conversations, which involve very, very deep listening, especially in the one-on-one level. So I want to unpack perhaps some of the implications for congregational life, but I want to go back in the to some themes you mentioned about counter publics. So you mentioned how politics is not simply pulling the lever in the voting booth whenever there's a national or state election, that you want politics also to be grounded in grassroots, local communities where local issues, which people are passionate about and care about and love and are engaged with, count. So here's maybe one way to get at the conversation. Are churches counter publics?
They can be. And I think it's about having a proper analysis of the power relationships that constitute that individual group. So if a congregation finds itself fighting for and always enforcing the status quo, then it's not a counter public, because it is fully in line with the broader public and the direction of how things are. A counter public is characterized by particular political and economic power relationships. So if a congregation finds itself, its members are consistently exploited or oppressed and marginalized, or consisting also of those who are standing in solidarity with those who are exploited, expropriated, and dominated, then it's a counter public, because its very life is countercultural in that way, and its life then is, its operations are counter to putting pressure on the broader public. So let's think concretely about this. The term counter public in this way comes from feminist discourse on political theory. Well, in the 1920s and earlier, feminists and those who were fighting for the rights of women outside of the household and inside of the household talked about the role of women in public differently and privately differently than others did. So their discourse that made up their life together was different. So you then, this is the inventions of the whole term of feminist itself and the woman's role, and the notion that women could actually hold not just social power, but also political power, right? Because all of these different structures are gendered in that way. So yeah, the feminist movement is one historical example about how it is that counter publics impacted and pressured the larger public. So did the Black churches, and so did neo-abolitionists and abolitionist movements in this way. And this is perhaps, equally just as familiar and common to any of your listeners if we think about the role of racial justice and how it is that Black churches fought for and pressured our larger collective life to adequately recognize politically and economically, right? Not just in a way that says you are about self-fulfillment in terms of recognition, but also in a sense of, no, we're going to build political and economic structures that show and that demonstrate that Black people count in this way. So churches can play a big role in these counter public movements through their life, through its membership. It just is de facto. Yeah, you're a congregation that's made up of individuals who experience marginalization, oppression, and expropriation and domination from the larger public. But it's also super important for us to recognize that churches can be in deep solidarity with those who are. So it's not only just about, where you find yourself positioned, It's about how it is that you act.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate the clarity in which you're illustrating this concept of counter publics. So, Aaron, I remember last week you were referencing in the community organizing space, many times religious communities and institutions and faith leaders are kind of instrumentalized so that quote unquote secular community organizing does not appreciate the sacred value or religious faith or theological motivations that religious communities bring to the organizing conversation. And part of what you wanted to do as a religious community organizer was to say, hey, there are sacred values embodied in these institutional traditions and practices that matter. If we don't engage that form of religious reasoning, then how are we going to get them to be in solidarity with our shared community kind of ends? So you were kind of challenging how community organizing is done from the perspective of a religious person. The question I want to ask you for our church member audiences is the other direction. So it's like, well, you are trained as a community organizer. Many times our congregations view that as worldly or secular or not part of the gospel or not part of what it means to follow the Spirit of Jesus Christ. And you're saying, well, hold on. There are certain practice, and you said the one-on-one meeting, the listening session, you consider these to be, I want to say, spiritual or religious practices. So say more about how you kind of understand Spirit and Holy Spirit and how your vision for Christian spirituality may be like, you want to expand our notions of what is spiritual.
Yeah, I think this is great. I mean, this is where I begin the book, right? So I'm reading this. I've led this congregation through its listening campaign, and then it ends with an accountability session with the local representative of our metro council. And the pastor is, I'm making an announcement to the congregation to invite everybody there. And then all of a sudden the pastor says, now I just want to remind everybody, this is not a political meeting. And I was sitting there in the congregation, my jaw just dropped. I was like, what, where did this come from? What is going on? And so I call him up, later that day. And I'm just like, okay, yeah, accountability session, was debrief, evaluating with him, how did it go? What's going on? And I said, why did you say that, Dury? Why did you make the announcement? Why did you say it's not a political meeting? And he said to me, well, I've got to push for some of the congregation that they thought it was, this meeting was trying to encourage people to vote in a particular way. And I said, that's partisanship. That's not politics. And furthermore, politics is about our life together and the goods that we hold in common and how they're produced, distributed, and accessed. Christian life is deeply concerned with that. And then, so the conversation ends. But this is the frame. I feel like when people consistently approach questions of community organizing, they incorporate and they sort of insert a distinction, a couple of distinctions. One, between they conflate politics and policy work or partisanship. So maybe we'll just start there. Like the basic difference between partisanship of being a part of a political party, the DNC, the RNC, or the Green Party, or whatever, the DSA, that is one thing. But the conditions of our life together, the state of your fellow neighbors, is that not what the Bible's about? Is that not what Jesus consistently teaches us? The Gospel of Luke begins in that way, Luke 4. So I feel, and I'm not alone in this, right? Listening to the Spirit, the radical social gospel, there is a deep tradition, wide tradition of Christians who have consistently fought and argued and pushed for people to see Christian life as deeply concerned about our worldly conditions, about our life together. God is concerned about that? Well, certainly, yeah, there are other things that we need to think about. If we are creatures in between times. We are not yet there. Well, the not yet is we're not yet. We're still treading water here. We've got to figure out how it is that we can keep each other afloat. And that is difficult. And so I think that this conception then of spirit, of listening to the spirits here, is one way that I want to talk about it, because about the work of Christian life, about discipleship, about mission, about vocation and identity of the church, about the church actually being most accurately defined through a task, a calling, actions rather than an identity, right? A state of being, right? And it's a sort of hat that you can put on. You shall know them by their love, right? Well, what are relationships of love? What are relationships of liberation? So spirit in this way, yes, listening to the Spirit, as we talked about last time, in the one sense, is about listening to the Holy Spirit, about attuning ourselves to God's gracious initiative in the world and how it is that our relationships are transformed by God's presence and graciousness. We are different because of God's love. We act differently. And God's Spirit then is a presence through which that transforms our ways of life and our daily practices. So it is certainly, listening to the Spirit is a Holy Spirit in that way. And in a one-on-one, you're listening to and attuning and attending to your neighbor and caring for their stories that they're sharing with you, which are points of vulnerability. And it is really a pastoral, a ministerial work here of holding the other lightly and in love, because they are a child of God that you're called to care for. But spirit is also about the state of our ethical relationships. It's also about democratic notions of accountability and responsibility. This goes back to our previous conversation around social pragmatism, and the inductive way of doing this work, of the scholarly about the scholarship of this, the approach to this is just how self-consciousness and human reasoning gets itself worked out through basic practices of making inferences and judgments about the world and others in it, and then being held accountable for those judgments and responsible for those judgments, and doing the same to others. So that as a reasoning creature who makes that reasoning possible only through a social and shared practice of practical reasoning. And so there's a sort of ethical, I'm going to be held accountable for my judgment. This is just how we talk, right? If I'm going to say something, you're going to take me as seriously about that. You're going to take me as a source of authority. And so we're going to be, this is just how we're going to make our way forward. Christians then understand that work is spiritually freighted in this way, because we're not just pursuing our own ends, we're also pursuing and discerning the ends that God is calling us in our world. So Christian life in this way is deeply political, because we care deeply about the world and the goods in it and others in it. And we're called to protect and fight for those, because the larger structures of society often are set up in ways that are undemocratic, that are not accountable, that are not responsible, that dominate and exploit and expropriate others. And so we are called as Christians through this tradition of, the radical social gospel, that Christian norms, say, of justice can correct those. And we can make criticism and judgments about the world and even ourselves based on those norms, because Christians are not perfect. So it's all of a piece, right? Christian spirituality is deeply political, because it's deeply worldly, and because it's also deeply otherworldly, right? Because we're caught between the is and the ought, the already and the not yet. These are deeply ethical tensions.
That is a really tremendous and beautiful vision of how the spiritual and the political of our one are of one fabric. And I think it's deeply theological because it's grounded in what you were saying, God's love for God's creation, which incorporates all of these facets. And so part of me thought that is a fitting meditation to conclude on as people listen to this podcast, as they go for a walk, as they're driving their kids, they can carry this thought that the Spirit of Christ is percolating through every nook and cranny of our lives. All of this is of great concern to our Creator God. And our witness to the saving gospel of Christ is to shine a light and to be salt and light in the places where God has called us. So, Aaron, I just thank you so much for being an incredible conversation partner, for your work in community organizing and in the church, and for this really important book, Listening to the Spirit.
Thank you, David. This is such a joy.
We'll
Be well.
put a pause here, but I have a feeling I'm going to be continuing to talk with you on podcasts. Thank you, Aaron.